So follow-up Michael Grant had to his original question, what do you think of Zipboard, which uses OSB compared to plywood? That was earlier in our program, so you may have got to that, but I'll let you add some comments.
Yeah, so I might also, I think Fielder had another question that's a little bit similar. The most important thing is air tightness. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to discuss this, but if you have a 1-inch square hole in an 8 by 4 by 8 sheet of any material in a building, it could be the exterior sheathing, it could be the interior drywall. Like I said, you're gonna have 100 times more moisture transfer through that 1-inch hole than you will have through diffusion. And so the thing I like about Zip system is that if it's followed, it's very airtight. And so it's really kind of only allowing for diffusion. And in which case, OSB, if it's well protected and the edges are sealed, it's really going to be limited to just having that moisture coming from the inside. And if that's happening through diffusion, then it's much less likely to be a problem. I would highly recommend high storage materials around it. So cellulose would be a definite recommendation. Things that can help buffer moisture, high moisture content time frames, and like lots of cellulose and attics and stuff like that. So wherever you can help buffer that. But I understand OSB is a necessary product in the industry. If we all built with plywood, there isn't enough plywood. So if you use OSB, even more critical that you're really, really airtight everywhere else. And the frank truth is that OSB isn't that airtight. Well, it's not vapor tight either. So it's actually probably not bad OSB to use, would be the leakier OSB. You're just going to be more dependent on your weather barrier. The thing to think about is if there's a lot of freeze thaw in your area and it's a high humidity interior environment that can end up in your OSB at different times of the year. Usually, like some places where it's really going to be a big extreme like that, like Idaho or something, you're going to the air is also very dry typically, so it's not a problem. But one thing to think about, smaller homes are going to have more relative humidity, higher relative humidity, higher occupancy per foot than big homes. Bigger the home, probably less interior moisture problems. Smaller the home, that's where I start like getting more and more worried by material choices. And so that's important. Fielder, you asked about what is the impact to exterior OSB lined walls when an elastomeric painted stucco on exterior wall in a home in Florida. So let me restate that clearly for people. So home in Florida, super high humidity outside, and you've got OSB as your sheathing and an elastomeric paint basically, but it's a stucco on the outside. Well, most of those stucco assemblies are pretty vapor closed. In Florida, that's where you want the vapor closed to be. You want, if anything, it's really never the case. It's pretty standard year round that you're gonna have air conditioning inside. Very rare where it's an opposite event, but pretty much always it's more humid outside or more absolute moisture outside than inside. So the vapor barrier on the outside of the building is actually really, really good idea. It also means that it's typically not your coldest surface. You're gonna have your air conditioning inside, your drywall is gonna be kind of cold. And so that would be where there might be a moisture problem more than anything from a condensation standpoint. But if you don't insulate those walls well on the inside, then that can transfer to cold sheathing. So insulating, a vapor barrier over your OSB, I think is a really good idea, but it has to be applied really, really well. And so that, the problem is nothing is perfect. And I do like the idea of like a layer between that's like maybe an EPS foam board on the outside, and then your application over that. So EIFS, that kind of exterior foam and applied stucco, actually can work pretty well in a Florida environment, especially with a vapor, a relatively vapor closed foam board. So the more vapor closed the foam board, the better. The more vapor closed the stucco, the better. in that particular case, because there's just a tremendous amount of moisture, way, way more than you can produce inside a home in a heating dominated climate.
But EFIS is not ideal for the Pacific Northwest, correct?
No, bad idea. Well, because you're doing the opposite. It's stopping everything here, and a lot of the EFIS actually had some moisture storage capacity on the inboard, and so you kind of created this rot scenario. But yeah, EFIS is not a good idea typically here. But again, it really depends on how airtight your building is more than anything. The more airtight you are, that's your number one moisture damage control system. If you're like, oh, I want the building to breathe, I'm gonna let it, like, buildings breathe on their own. The vapor can transfer through materials at a microscopic level. That's what you want. You don't want vapor to transfer through big holes. It does that. That's your number one damage issue. You often see leaky areas around the bottom of windows because they're not air sealed well. And that combination of water hitting that area a lot and wetting the outside and the vapor leaving and condensing just creates this perfect storm, and you have rotten sills. And a lot of times what the answer will be by building owners or homeowners is to dial in the bulk water management on the outside, but they don't dial in the air tightness, and you continue to have that same air tightness issue and moisture buildup, and you can kind of repeat those same problems of the past.
Perfect. We have a couple more questions dealing with exterior insulation. So Courtney Jones says, you briefly touched on exterior insulation. Can you speak to the value add of adding exterior insulation, even if it's also a cost add? And Michael Smith adds to that, asking about cork exterior insulation.
I didn't bring up cork. Cork's great. Thanks for asking about that, because cork is also, considered a carbon negative material. Granted, you have to ship it here typically, but it's coming from either trucked up from California or shipped across the pond from Portugal, Spain. But cork's a great exterior insulation because it's vapor open. I love exterior insulation. Most of our buildings have exterior insulation. Majority of them are wood fiber or mineral wool. Some cork, we have done some cork. It's just kind of expensive, and so it depends on the project. The scale can really help that. Cork can also be an exterior cladding system. So we have done buildings with Prosoco, and then actually use it. It's a little bit tacky, and it's nice to use with cork because cork kind of, it's like it holds it there for a moment while you set your screws to set the cork. And it's because it's so vapor open, we felt comfortable with it because you're essentially creating this weather control and and also you're basically airtight layer at the Prosoco level is also very vapor open. It's a very vapor open assembly. It can't really store liquid water, but it can store moisture, and so typically it's still going to primarily dry to the outside. I really like it. You only have one opportunity to kind of get a building envelope right, typically, at least for the next 25 plus years. So to me, you have a responsibility to basically do this right now. I wouldn't add, exterior insulation without first upgrading my window and door package. That's run the math a bunch of different ways. Usually it's, cost neutral to kind of, upgrade your window door package versus add exterior insulation. But the math typically, almost every time I've run the math, unless it's just a ton of glazing on the outside of the building, which then too, it gets expensive on the window side. But the energy math is always going to say upgrade your windows, typically, if you have an already insulated wall assembly. Nice thing is, the more insulation you add to the outside, the more you protect your structure. Your structure in a heating dominated climate is pretty exposed to condensation and moisture damage through condensation. So as moisture is moving through, that surface gets colder, it's condensing. Now that's not necessarily bad in materials that can dry rapidly and store moisture, especially if there's a rain screen on the other side, like plywood. If you can just think about it this way: you took a can of, out of the fridge and put it in a room on a humid day, it's going to be sweating with a lot of water on the outside. But if you took a piece of plywood out and put it on the counter, it might look a little damp, but it's not going to feel might just feel a little damp. It's not going to have like actual liquid water on it, right? And so it's also going to want to dry to the drier side. And so typically that's going to be the outside. So it's going to rapidly dry to the outside. The problem is when it's moist like that and it freezes, that freeze thaw cycle can expand contraction with multiple 5 layers or more of cross laminated. Plywood can deal with that pretty well. OSB absolutely really can't. A few times like that, it definitely is going to be more leaky. It can become a problem. So I really, really like exterior insulation because it protects those layers. Now your OSB is much better protected, especially if it's vapor open on the outside. It can still, whatever moisture kind of gets into that OSB, it can dry out. I love cork, I love wood fiber board, and I love mineral wool, probably in that order. And then EPS, and then specifying low global warming potential, low carbon, XPS, which is now in the market.
We have a question from Benjamin Wilt. Do you have any concerns with vapor smart air barriers between gypsum and framing / insulation?
No, again, the more airtight, still important here, but smart vapor barriers essentially, what they're designed to do is allow moisture to transfer from the high side to a low side. And so in that Florida example, if we wrapped it in a smart barrier, well, it's always going to be high side on the outside. So it's only going to, allow vapor to transfer out, but it's not going to allow any vapor to transfer into the building. So it will never allow that reverse, or the standard drive. So it's only a smart barrier. Actually, no, that's the reverse. What am I thinking about? It's a smart barrier. Sorry, I think I said this wrong. Smart barrier is always going to block vapor on the high side and allow vapor just from the low side to transfer. So that is, that can be a good thing from a house standpoint, because essentially what you're doing is you're like, all right, we're not going to, if it's really moist inside, we're not going to allow moisture in. But if moisture gets inside that wall assembly, it does allow it kind of back out to that high side. So I like it. It's a little gimmicky in that it's really a vapor barrier, but it allows some transfer. That's probably the best way to describe it. And at that point, maybe just a vapor barrier is fine, but it does have some basically elasticity and vapor transfer. So I think they're good.
We have a question from Bruce McIntosh, who says, what's the best wall assembly for an existing basement and an older home? So the basement has been dry, but built in 1948.
Yeah, so it's probably dry because it's 1948, everything else inside. And so, maybe it's a natural gas furnace or hot water heater, or air is warm in there. So there's probably a ton of moisture because there wasn't like whatever damp proofing may have been done, very unlikely in 1948. Below grade isn't there anymore, or not effective. So there's a lot of moisture transfer through through that wall assembly. 1948 foundation is going to be pretty good. You still might see some effervescence, some of that salt's coming through. That's a good indication there's a lot of vapor transfer, any of those white salts building up. But what you want to do is stop that, and you want to do it with a product that's not going to rot, right? So what we like to do is a 10 mil, like a Raven vapor block, 10 mil vapor barrier against that concrete. And so I'd seal that up to a mud sill above, bring it down, flap it into the room below, put my, and so when I put my framing, I can frame over the top of that 10 mil vapor barrier. So basically you just trap any moisture that gets, through that wall is trapped behind my vapor barrier. I like to run, even a clean, if I can, run a bead of sealant underneath. Or if I bring that vapor barrier in, oftentimes I might be finishing a basement and I'll put a vapor barrier down for the floor and I'll tape it with a really good Sega style tape and continue a 10 mil vapor barrier all the way through the floor. Now, any vapor that gets through a building is just under or behind that plastic, and it's well sealed. Ideally, there's a floor drain somewhere under that plastic it could go to at a low point. but that would be my perfect scenario. After that, I would like to put up typically about 1.5 inches of foam board. And, again, you can use an EPS that has like a radiant barrier on it already. That's vapor closed, or, make sure it has not paper, but a barrier on it, or, a low carbon XPS, and that'll help warm up that assembly too. And then you can put up your wood framing, and then you can actually blow in, like a fiberglass insulation, or even a cellulose insulation. We've done some testing, and that seems to work really, really well, but it has to be detailed well. And you have to think about, moisture potentially even coming through, from the outside through rim joists. You want those rim joists nice and sealed. So good foam blocks and the rim joists, taping those up. Yeah, old basements can be done and really well and durably, but vapor block that wall. Do not use a vapor open material like Tyvek, or another really great weather barrier is just old felt paper. Don't use that, because again, it's one of the reasons it's so great is it allows a lot of vapor transfer but stops bulk water. You don't want to have a lot of vapor transfer there.
Our final question is from Jan Fingerler. He says, it's hard to install exterior boards to the underside of the floor due to tightness of crawl space in our Pacific Northwest marine mixed climate. Is it feasible to omit exterior insulation such as rigid boards, etc., from the bottom of the floor framing insulated with blown fiberglass?
Yeah, I'd actually, one thing, or there's also a question of how you install that 1.5 inch foam. I would just glue that to use a construction adhesive right to the 10 mil vapor barrier, but and then tape the seams on that. So it becomes a secondary barrier. The foam board actually in a crawl space, in a perfect world, it would be underneath your plywood, because now you've reversed the situation. You have a lot of moisture. The moisture drives typically from the ground up. And so I actually would like to have the house also be able to dry to the outside. So again, crawl space, super important thing to do is a 10 mil vapor barrier on the ground. So make sure you've got nice dry ground. You do not want to have any exposed earth in your crawl. And that included if it's a vented crawl, absolutely, still 10 mil and up to the concrete, taped to the concrete. No foam board is fine, but I think in that particular instance, I would use like a Tyvek as a barrier underneath, make it nice and airtight. So you could tape that Tyvek or whatever weather barrier, make it nice airtight. Any moisture that gets into that space can dry out through your venting. You're not bringing extra moisture in through the ground. And yeah, if anything, I would actually prefer to have, like everywhere else, a vapor open assembly there. So again, wood fiber board or cork or mineral wool, if I put anything under there. But if you can just fill that entire assembly with blown fiberglass, that's a lot of extra insulation typically than what we generally would have. And then, like I said, if I were to add anything, I would want to have an air barrier like Tyvek.
We did have one more question that came in regarding spray foam. So general thoughts, but then also comment on the health effects of spray foam after installation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of neurotoxins that have been found in a lot of lawsuits because of health related issues that have been found with foams. One of the issues, you have better blowing agents these days, but they're not all better too, and it's hard to specify things and make sure it's actually what you get on a job site, especially now with supply chain issues and regrettable kind of replacements that'll happen without even your knowledge. You're making your basically building site a total lab where they're formulating plastic from a liquid to a solid in an environment that's always changing. And so it's a very imperfect science. And sometimes like low density foams, they might never actually fully cure. And so yes, maybe under fully cured instances, it's less toxic. But the problem is when they don't fully cure, they'll continue to off gas at the highest toxicity level. And that can be for like 15 years. And so they've shown these problems where there have been, install issues. It might be relative humidity was too high. The mixture was a little off. The other thing about foam is that the low densities tend to shrink over time or pull away from framing. The high densities tend to crack. And so they have failures. They perform really well out of the gate. But they do have there has been instances where there's been failures over time, shattering or shaling. Some installs have done really well, some haven't. And so the biggest issue for me with foams is that it's a shortcut. It's plastic that, forever stuck to the wood. If you can use natural materials and, if you get better at doing things like just dialing in your weather barrier as an air barrier, that's a much more important step than, if you do a spray foam, the problem is it's not also protecting the building from water intrusion. And now you've reduced the storage capacity. There's no real storage capacity at all because you've actually sealed out your framing. And so moisture buildup, can become much more problematic. You're like, oh, it can't grow mold, but the drywall can. And so, indoor air quality issues can start to spike. And so I really just, I was excited about it 20 years ago, and we started using it, and then I started having experiences with it, and then I stopped. And I just generally recommend not doing it if you can. Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.